So good afternoon, everyone. I'm just waiting a couple of seconds while you all join us from the waiting room. Just takes a few seconds to get there, but we will get underway in just a moment. Okay. Let us make a start. So good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union in the time of the COVID-19 pandemic. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, are Janis Emmanouilidis, Director of Studies, and Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive. And our special guest this week, particularly delighted to welcome Simona Guagliardo, who is a policy analyst at the EPC and will be joining us for the first half of this session as we discuss the prospects for a European health union and consider what impact all the rows and controversies over the EU's COVID vaccine procurement might have on the prospects for a greater EU role in health after the pandemic. We're then going to go on to assess the impact of this row and wider tensions between the EU and the UK post-Brexit, and finally assess what all of this means for Ursula von der Leyen's Commission, which has, of course, come under fierce attack over the last week for her handling of both parts of this issue. As always, totally interactive discussions, questions from me to our panel, and then later on, I hope, from all of you. Just a reminder, you are all muted for now. Click on the Q&A button, not the chat button, the Q&A button, and write your question, and please keep it brief, or click on the raise hands button if you prefer to speak, and use the chat button if you're having any IT issues and would like help from our wonderful team behind the scenes. So Simona, a very warm welcome. Great to have you with us. Gentlemen, as always, let's start with COVID-19 and the prospects for a EU health union. Janis, could I come to you first on the major political row that has broken out? There's a lot of legalities and technicalities, which none of us are lawyers as far as I'm aware, so we won't get into. But your assessment of the way the Commission has handled the row with AstraZeneca and the wider problems that we've been seeing in relation to procurement, how do you see what's happened?
Well, first of all, I think we need to distinguish. We need to distinguish between the procurement, the joint procurement, which happened since the summer of last year, and the recent row, as you called it, with AstraZeneca. I think we are now smarter than we were some weeks ago with respect to what went wrong when it comes to joint procurement. And I think that there were mistakes which were committed. I think that many actors, including the Commission, but also others, would probably do things differently this time around if they would have to redo everything. There were mistakes which were committed. The coordination between the EU 27 took time. There was a high price sensitivity, which I think was a mistake. Safety came first, so the approval of the European Medicines Agency took longer. Liability questions, personal data security questions, also which vaccine should be chosen. I think all of that led to the time delay, which we're now seeing in the rollout of the vaccines. And by the way, this is not only to be attributed to the Commission, because it was also the member states through the Council and other bodies which were involved in that process. But now when it comes to the AstraZeneca case, I think that that was bad crisis management. It seemed for some days that the Commission was in panic, that they were reacting to pressures from member states, that there was a loss of control, and that there was, yes, a need to put pressures on companies that they fulfill the obligations, that you also needed strong sticks, including the expert transparency, control mechanisms. But there were a lot of mistakes which I think were committed. Including also the attempt by Ursula von der Leyen to push responsibility away from her, which created tensions within the Commission itself, and also was conveying the wrong picture, I think, to the wider audience. So I think with respect to AstraZeneca, to the row, I think that was bad crisis management, a lot of mistakes which were committed.
Yeah, and we'll come back later on, I hope at the end of this session, to a bit of an assessment of what all this means for her presidency, for the Commission. But Fabian, bad crisis management, but also bad PR management, do you think?
Yes, I think it was handled badly. And I think that is something where there will certainly be some reflection, but I think there are bigger issues here which we need to consider, and they have to do with the nature of this exercise and what we tried to do, and that we did something which was unprecedented beforehand. We had never done something like this at the European level. There are very good reasons, fundamental reasons, why it is better to do together at the European level, including, for example, the effect it would have had on smaller countries, on countries which don't have the weight of purchasing power, which don't have production facilities. So there were very good reasons why we should do it together, but we didn't have any of the mechanisms or any of the framework in place, which is needed for this very complex exercise. We didn't have any kind of consideration beforehand about how we would react to crises like this. Our export restrictions, for example, which are used by many countries around the world, are they a good tool to address issues around these kind of questions? So these are things where I think we need to learn for the longer term, rather than trying to find a situation now where we apportion blame to someone.
And that's an interesting point, because Simona, I wanted to ask you, as we turn and look at the prospects for a health union, this was of course supposed to be the great demonstration of the benefits of working as a bloc, of working together. And Fabian seems to be arguing here, actually this is a demonstration that it is important to work together, that was the right way to do it, but we didn't have the mechanism in place. So how do you see this argument, if you agree with that assessment, Simona, playing out in terms of, will people say in the wider health union debate, well, this just shows that working together on health issues is a bad idea? Or will they say, this just shows it's a good idea, but we need to do it in a more systemic way? What is your reading of the impact on the bigger debate?
Yes, Jacki, thank you. I agree with what was said before by Fabian. This is an exercise that it is better to do it at the EU level, for obvious reasons, but it is also an exercise that the EU was not prepared to handle. So I think there is a lot of frustration, of course, over delays in vaccine delivery at the national level. And for this reason, vaccinations campaigns are being slowed down. And of course, this translates into frustration within national governments. And this feeling, I think, could fuel the narrative at the national level that health issues are best dealt with nationally. I mean, the risk is there, and the enthusiasm over stronger EU action in health could be undermined. But I think this is why it is now the time to defend the common approach that was taken, and to stress the benefits of this common approach, and maybe also explain them better to national governments, to EU citizens, to civil society, and to explain why this approach was adopted in the first place. And I mean, the reasons are there. The EU wanted to prioritize solidarity, as Fabian was mentioning, with smallest EU members. And I think it is also important, the issue of liability of vaccine producers. And I want to stress this point, because we often forget that Europe is the global epicenter of vaccine hesitancy. So citizens really need to trust vaccines in order for these campaigns to be successful.
So there were good reasons for why they behaved the way they did, but haven't necessarily, as you say, been properly explained. I want to come back, and of course we've seen the UK saying, well, look, this just shows how much better it is if you do it alone. I'll come back on that. I want to come back on the Northern Ireland Protocol issue later, because if we start on that, we'll never talk about the health union, which is the important issue we're really here to talk about today. But before we move on, Fabian, would you agree with Simona's concern that however important and beneficial it is for the bloc to work together, this could, as she put it, fuel a narrative that health issues are better dealt with at national level?
I think clearly it could. There is already a tendency for some countries to think that in any case. So anything which support that can then lead into that direction. But I think we should also not forget that we don't actually have a counterfactual here. We don't know what would have happened if we hadn't gone down this route. And I think the assumption that everything would have been wonderful, that we would have been able to do this, I think we have to question. There are a number of also uncertainties in a situation like that. As Simona said, for example, one of the big issues is about trust in vaccination. If we had gone ahead, rolled it out very quickly, and something had gone wrong, we would be in a situation where the whole vaccination program could be in question. If we don't reach enough of the population, then the vaccination is not going to work. It's not going to address what we're trying to get to, which is some form of herd immunity. So there is also a reason to be more cautious, to be at times slower than it should be. So trying to compare this to now a hypothetical situation where everything would have worked very well if it had been done by the member states, I think is not really fair in this situation.
Because we also do see issues relating to distribution in different member states, and some successes, some failures. But Janis, you wanted to come in here, and if I could just say, how does the EU then avoid what Simona fears? How should the Commission, how should the Council, how should the EU institutions play this debate over, okay, what lesson do we draw from this? Do we draw the lesson that we need to do it better and have the mechanisms in place in advance? Or do we draw the lesson that we should retrench? How do they champion the first approach and fend off the second?
I think by showing successes. Yes, we have now the problems which we're having, and there are reasons why we're having these problems, but the situation will be evaluated not only now, but in a month, in 2 months, in 6 months' time. And the question then will be, yes, was there only a hiccup in the beginning? It took a while, it took longer than it took in countries like the UK or the US. Israel, I think, is a very particular case, which you need to look at into detail in order to figure out why it worked differently there. And this was not the path for Europeans to take. So if in a month or in 2 months or 3 months' time, vaccination will have, we have had seen a different speed in terms of the number of people being vaccinated in the member states. And if we will have cooperated better with the pharmaceutical companies, because this was one of the mistakes we committed, we left them to determine the production capacities which they will have. Supporting them in that effort is something which is necessary. Also putting pressure on them to cooperate more also with other pharmaceutical companies throughout Europe to make sure that the vaccines which we need and which they have also obliged to deliver will be delivered. So I think from the mistakes which have been committed over the past 5-6 months, we can learn lessons from that and also now improve things. And in some ways, what we have gone through over the past weeks is helping in that process of making sure that we are producing better results. But on the other hand, I think that a lot of the points which led to the hiccup, to the delays, are reasons which in many ways are understandable. You can explain them. Safety first is something which you can explain also to people. The liability question is something you can explain to people. I think the price sensitivity was a mistake. We should have spent more, because spending more would actually not have meant that much, because we're spending so much every day, every week on countering the effects of the crisis on our economies. But having said all that, we always knew when it comes to health union that this is a very tough cookie because of the competence structure, not only between the national and the European, but also between the national and the subnational level.
Okay, Fabian, you want to come with a quick one, and then I want to come to Simona, because I want to turn our attention to the broader question of where we are with the debate on the health union, where before the events of the last 2 weeks erupted, where were we in that discussion? But Fabian, quick one if you would.
Just very quick, what matters in the end is success. I mean, that obviously sounds a bit self-evident, but I think when we actually follow the discussion in many countries, there doesn't seem to be a focus on what should matter, which is in the end, how do we get this health crisis under control? How do we avoid unnecessary death? How do we avoid an overburdening of health systems? I mean, this is what we need to get to. Now, vaccination is one part of that puzzle. It's an important part, but it's also not the solution by itself. And I think sometimes we forget that this is about a much wider strategy, and that in the end, there are also different strategies where we don't know at the moment what is the right way. Is it better to vaccinate lots of people very quickly, or should we focus first on certain groups, which might be harder to get to, so it takes longer. So these are the kind of questions which I think haven't been resolved yet.
Simona, you wanted to react to this conversation, but then also can I ask you to move us on to the bigger picture of where, before the events of the last 2 weeks, as I said, where we were with the health union debate. There had been some building blocks that were beginning to be put in place. But what was the political atmosphere around this debate, and how much progress were we making?
Yes, just one last element to conclude the issue we were discussing. I agree that the EU is at a point now that it needs to show successes and results, but I also want to stress that there is a need to give more capacity at the EU level, because I mean, member states feel like we have proven ourselves. We have healthcare systems in place. We know how to work with health systems. We have experience and capacity in this sense. Now the EU is coming in, and the EU, of course, needs to prove itself. But without the capacity, without existing mechanism to do so, it's very difficult. So it's a dog chasing tail situation that we need to escape. Moving to the European Health Union, since President von der Leyen announced the intention to build this strong health union, as you said, a number of measures have been put in place, and we are looking at the health security framework. We are looking at proposals to strengthen the EU agencies, ECDC and the medicines agencies. We are looking at the new pharmaceutical strategies. So there are interesting first blocks in place, and the feeling that I have is that member states overall approved these pillars, even though they are always cautious to give an immediate green light. All of these proposals, they need to go through discussion, and member states will have to look into the details. And something that they always mention, I think, is finding ways to avoid administrative burdens, for example, finding ways to avoid duplication of tasks. Why do we need another EU agency if we have something already in place? So these are all points that will need to be discussed. One reflection on, maybe two reflections on this. The first one is, of course, we need to see what will happen, because the proposals are in place, and member states will need to discuss all of these issues. But maybe and a second reflection, which is closer to my heart, I would say, I feel that the focus of these first building blocks is very much on strengthening crisis preparedness and management, is very much on emergency politics, let's call it that way. Yes, we have a couple of proposals, for example, the cancer plan, which was adopted 2 days ago. We have this proposal looking at prevention issues and other topics which are not strictly related to crisis management. But I think that the bulk, the stronger focus of these first building blocks are on short-term objectives. How do we deal with this crisis? How do we deal with infection disease control? And how do we deal with cross-border health threats? What is missing, I feel, is a much stronger focus on the longer-term objective, which should be that of building more resilient health systems for better health.
Can I ask whether that is because you think, obviously there is a crisis and we're responding to it, but that the Commission senses an appetite in member states for crisis management and doesn't sense an appetite, a political appetite for the more long-term vision that you're talking about? Is that the reasoning? It's pragmatic, where we can make progress?
Yes, of course, the Commission. Of course, the Commission puts on the table things that the Commission thinks are feasible to achieve, that match the political sensibility of member states. But then my feeling is, why shouldn't we be bolder than that? There is a lot of talking within the Brussels health community about improving, about taking a step further. So I think that this really needs to be the key of the discussion around health policy. How do we move forward?
Janis, your sense of where the politics of this lies and the degree to which member states will go beyond those crisis management elements that Simona was talking about, whether they really are prepared to contemplate a genuine health union going beyond rapid response, as it were.
Well, I think that what Simona said earlier was very correct when she said that we need to see how things will develop. And there is a danger that actually, if the negative spiral which we've seen developing over the past week continues, then that I think will have a severe negative impact. If we see that, yes, this was a problem, this was a hiccup, we committed some mistakes, we also say that we committed some mistakes and explain what went wrong or where we lacked experience and that led to the problems which we have envisaged. If you handle that, and if you get into a situation where we will be looking back at what happened in January or February and saying, okay, the mistakes happened, we lost time, but at the end of the day, we were able to regain some of the lost space. There were new vaccines which are now coming, Johnson & Johnson, maybe also some vaccines which were seen very critical some weeks ago, like Sputnik 5. We'll see how that will develop. That I think will to a big extent determine the readiness of member states to engage more when it comes to creating a health union. However, the basic problem, and I think that's underneath what Simona was describing when we were saying we actually need more to create more resilient health systems. And that's something where Europeans should cooperate. I think there's a feeling in many member states, and also at the subnational level, by the way, especially in federal countries, and to argue this actually is not what we need the European Union for. What we need it for is when we have concrete, difficult situation where transnationally we have to cooperate in order to deal with the crisis which we're facing and learn the mistakes and the lessons of what happened in the COVID-19 situation in order to be better prepared in future when future situations of crisis will occur. And Simona is right in principle, the necessity to be more proactive in terms of avoiding health challenges in future. I think even though that's right, I think that member states and also many actors in the member states, subnational actors, will be countering these developments. So this will be a very tough discussion.
Yeah, and absolutely, it's a tough discussion at national level, never mind then at EU level. Struck by what you said about admitting mistakes and explaining why they happened, not something modern politicians are famous for. Question mark over whether the Commission will feel it can do that for the mistakes it's made and whether others will also feel they can do that at some point in the future. But Fabian, your assessment of the broader political debate that's going on now about a health union.
First, I wanted to pick up the point you just made, because it's interesting, I think, in the current crisis that this is not the experience we've had. When we look across the world, it is actually leaders who have been able to say that the situation is uncertain, that they are making mistakes, that this is a difficult weighing up between very different types of costs and challenges. They are the ones who have actually been seen as more credible, as more trustworthy, as being able to deal with the crisis better. So at the moment, there seems to be a premium for being honest, for being that kind of politician. And I think that is something we should also try to emulate at the European level. But I think in terms of where we are, I fully agree. It is a difficult discussion. Just because something makes sense doesn't mean it leads to a situation where member states are willing to then transfer those powers to the European Union. Also because we have to recognize that the differences between member states are still very large. There are very different approaches to how health systems function, but also the level of health provision, the health inequalities across the European Union are still very large. So it's quite difficult to find a way of getting that all under one hat. And I think what we are going to see is rather smaller steps in a number of different areas than a big step towards a big health union, whatever that might mean in the end. But we should never forget that in the end, when it comes to healthcare, one of the big considerations has to be money. Health costs money, and it costs a rather lot of money. And when it comes to a lot of money, then all discussions are always more difficult. And in particular, doing things together at the European level becomes much more difficult if you have a finance.
Absolutely. Simona, a series of small steps is the best we can hope for, and maybe is the most practical way forward. Would you agree with that? And could I also ask you, Angela Merkel has already put this on the table as a topic for the Conference on the Future of Europe when it gets underway, whenever that will be. Do you think that might be a forum for this bigger discussion that you're calling for, this more long-term perspective on tackling this issue?
Well, yes, on your first question, Jacki, I agree that smaller steps might be more practical and the way to go with. And because I agree with Fabian and Janis, I do not see member states particularly eager to discuss health competences and to explore the possibility of reforming the way health governance work in Europe. But still, I'm an optimistic by nature.
Good to hear.
Yeah, on the conference on the future of Europe, I think it would be the perfect venue whenever it gets underway, as you say, and I think the conference might support this process of moving the discussion from Brussels to member states. And of course, it would need to involve citizens, it would need to involve civil society, but I would really like to see the discussion going into national parliaments. So I'm not sure how this can happen, but I mean, the conference, it's still underway, as you say, so it's not clear who will lead it, what the topics will be on the agenda, and who will participate in the process. So there are a lot of unanswered questions on this issue, but I really think that I mean, it would be a pity, if not a problem, not to take advantage of the Conference of the Future of Europe to discuss this.
Quick one from Fabian, quick one from Janis, and then I'm going to take a couple from the floor before we move on.
Well, as most of you will know, I'm not that optimistic by nature. And so I'm going to put a little warning around that. Because yes, I think it is right that we should discuss this. It is an important issue, and we should have a discussion. What should we do at the European level? But where I would be very cautious is that we don't set up another expectation capability gap. That we are in a situation where citizens think, yes, the European Union not only should do something on health, but is capable of doing something on health, but we don't see then at the same time any of the tools being transferred to the European Union. So we end up in a situation where any failure is then put at the feet of the European Union, but we never had a chance at the beginning because we never had the instruments to do it. So, and I think there's a tendency towards that we identify a big problem, and I think the tendency is also within the institutions that we identify a big problem which we know is important to citizens. So we want to give the impression that we can do something about it, but if we don't have the right instruments in place, and if there's no willingness to transfer them, I think we need to be very cautious.
Okay, thank you very much. Janis.
Well, I think that the issue of health will clearly be on the agenda of the Conference on the Future of Europe. It is in the center of attention today, and it will be when the conference starts, assuming that it will start potentially on the 9th of May. So it will be on the conference agenda. I personally hope that it will not be centerpiece of the conference itself, because of what Fabian was indicating. You will create expectations potentially also the conference and what happens after the conference, which is even more important when it comes to implementing what has been discussed and decided in the framework of the conference, creating expectation which actually the European Union will struggle to fulfill. Having said that, and here Simona is right, the conference is a mechanism by which you can trigger debates also beyond the Brussels bubble in the member states. National parliamentarians will be, one can expect, will be involved in the Conference on the Future of Europe. So there is a mechanism to use the conference in order to have a wider, broader debate on these issues so that you have the conference being used, as I've said in the past, as a pressure function. As a pressure function in order to make sure that at European level, some of the things which the Commission is advocating will actually become true. And by the way, I will be happy if whenever, I'm knocking on wood, but whenever we're hit by the next grave pandemic, that we will be better prepared than we were this time around. And this, I think, is where we need to learn the right lessons now, use the conference in order to improve things, because what we've seen is that countries or regions which have gone through similar experiences are now much better, in a much better situation to deal with the COVID-19 situation in their given country, in the given region. So this is also something which we should aim to achieve when we get out of this crisis, and will be before a next pandemic, whenever that will come.
Thank you very much indeed. I notice I'm not, if I could ask our wonderful team to make me co-host, because at the moment I can't allow people to talk, but in the meantime, maybe one of you could do it for me and allow, we've got 3 hands up. I'd like to take all of those. I suspect the issue that I have been leaving to one side for the moment, but we're going to come to in a minute, the issue of Northern Ireland and the row with the UK over the vaccines is about to come up. But let's go to Malcolm Harbour first of all. Malcolm, can you unmute yourself? Malcolm, can you? You unmuted yourself and then you muted again.
Yes, well, I got a separate button.
There we go.
Yes, well, it's a pleasure to see you all. Just to say that my wife and I have both been vaccinated. I just want to perhaps just reflect a bit on what I think are some lessons where, in this case, what the UK has done are relevant to what we've been talking today. Not in an arrogant sense, actually, but I mean, because I think, you know, we have to learn from everybody. I mean, first of all, I have to say that the National Health Service in the UK, which is, I think, certainly the largest single integrated health service across the EU, that a whole unified sector, has come into its own in terms of delivering vaccines quickly, and their whole operation has been handled extremely efficiently and in a very user-friendly way. So I was telephoned on a Sunday morning.
Sorry, Malcolm, it's going to have to be brief. I would love to discuss this at length, but we're really not going to have time. Sorry.
Right. Just to say that's been an advantage that everybody can learn from. In other words, it's about systems and integration in terms of what you're going to add value at a European level. I think the most important thing is, and Mrs. von der Leyen said in her Politico interview this morning, is that the EU didn't think about the whole manufacturing and industrial chain for supply of the vaccines, whereas the UK went and bought vaccines at risk, underwrote the risk of the vaccine suppliers, and developed a supply chain and funded the manufacturing chain. And that's because they started well up the system. Lesson 1, that's okay. But secondly, and quickly, regulators, which you can do at a European level. The UK regulator worked with the manufacturers in a rolling process, getting the data as the vaccine was developed to minimize the delays when it was improved. Okay. Now, both of those things seem to me absolutely fundamental about added value to any sort of EU health program. And you have to sort out the question of drug pricing.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Sorry, Malcolm. We really don't have long. Giving you a couple of minutes, I'm going to have to move on. But I take your points, lessons that can be learned and lessons that we should learn. John Palmer, you have the floor. John.
Thank you. My question is rather different. I think that many of the issues that have been discussed so far reflect on all the players across the Union, their weaknesses and shortcomings, and there have been many in the UK for which the British authorities have been responsible. Vaccination is not one of them, but there are many others. My question is, how could it happen? Has the panel got any idea of how precisely it could happen that the Commission would, in trying to handle this, trigger apparently an unexpected time bomb of enormous significance, namely the implied suspension of the articles governing Northern Ireland? This is a question qualitatively different to any other aspect of this crisis.
Absolutely, John. Thank you very much. And I'll come to that in just a moment with our panel. Let me give Ana Gomez the floor before I do that. Ana.
Hello, here I come from Portugal, a country that would never have been able to provide vaccines if it weren't the EU common effort. So I think that perspective needs to be taken on board clearly. By the way, we had an action plan against chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats back from 2010 with the entry in force of the Lisbon Treaty. I did the report in the European Parliament at that time. We thought that the action plan was very weak. I recall that the experts on biological threats, we had already had SARS, were British, and all is there. But my question is now exactly why doesn't the EU take this as a public goods question, and it's not just a market thing. I mean, we need the EU to take this issue as a health issue, as a public goods question, and indeed we must interfere in the whole process of manufacturing, but as well of taking liability, the liability of the manufacturers who have.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. More a point than a question there. Simona, before I let you go, and I will then come back on the question of Article 16, the Northern Ireland Protocol and all of that with Fabian and Janis. But Simona, did you want to quickly react to anything you've heard before we move on?
Yes, I wanted to make a point on why the EU process was slower than the UK, referring to Malcolm's question. Also, the EMA acted following the rolling reviews procedure, and what was different is the authorization. The authorization process that was followed. That in the EMA followed the marketing conditional marketing authorization, which took longer, which is not an emergency procedure, and of course it took longer. This is one of the reasons why the EU was slower, but the marketing authorization allows for liability to stay with companies, and this relates to the point I was making earlier. We need citizens to trust this vaccine, and this is also something. This is also one of the reasons why EMA took this decision. On what was mentioned by Anna, I agree with the perspective of solidarity. I mean, solidarity was the key topic that was the reason why the EU acted as it did, and it's also, I think, also it is also important to consider health as a public good, as Anna was mentioning.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Simona, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful and look forward to having you back at a later date to discuss more progress in this area. Fabian, let us turn to John Palmer's question and use that to segue into our conversation about EU-UK relations, she said with a very heavy heart and a very heavy voice. First of all, the row, the triggering of Article 16 of the Northern Ireland Protocol to try to ensure that if necessary, you could stop exports to the UK via Northern Ireland. How did this happen? How big a mistake was it? And can it be undone? Because it seems to have been already seized on in the UK by Brexiteers, by Northern Irish political parties as an excuse to bring the whole thing into question again. So how did we get to where we are at the end of what has been a very torrid couple of weeks?
I think the first point to make is really just to say that it clearly was a mistake. It should not have happened. And that is also reflected in the speed in which it came under fire, not just from the UK, but within the European Union, and the speed in which it was reversed. So in some ways, you could argue that nothing actually happened. And I would actually argue that it was never likely to happen. There was not a real chance that this would be enacted because there were too many actors within the European Union which would have stopped it. However, what has happened is that it has given a particular impression within the public debate. It has fueled the fires, as you said, of skeptics of the deal. And it has highlighted also some of the weaknesses of the arrangements where we have, unfortunately, instability built into the system. And now that genie is out of the bottle, and I would probably have argued that it would come out of the bottle at some point in any case, because of these arrangements not being stable over time. But it will be very difficult to put it back in. Now, the question is, what are the consequences of that? The consequences are not going to be a renegotiation of this agreement. The consequences are, I don't think, going to be that the UK will step away from the agreement as a whole. That would still have the impact which they tried to avoid at the beginning of the year. But I think what it shows is that rather than settling the EU-UK relationship, we are still in a situation where that relationship is very precarious, where it is very confrontational, where it is much more about blame than cooperation. And all of this, together with also all the other difficulties, because we shouldn't forget that this is only one element in a range of difficulties which have appeared over the last month. All of this, in my view, shows that actually we have an unstable system which is going to be under pressure, and we might well end up in a situation where the whole agreement starts to shake, if not collapse.
Well, I was going to ask you before I come to you, if I might, Janis. I mean, we have a situation in relation to Northern Ireland where the British Prime Minister said he would never agree to a border in the Irish Sea. Then he agreed to a border in the Irish Sea. Then he told everybody he hadn't agreed to anything that amounted to a border and there would be no checks. Then they implemented it. And now, after the Commission triggered Article 16, he threatens in the House of Commons this week to do precisely the same. So are you sure? This looks, I mean, the EU could be forgiven for suspecting he never intended to implement the protocol. And then what we're seeing now, he was just waiting for an excuse to pounce on. Do you share that analysis at all, or am I being unduly cynical? And then I'll come to you, Janis.
Well, whether he intended or not, the EU should certainly not have given him the excuse to start with this whole debate. I think, yes, there was always an instability because precisely the UK government had to square a circle. At some point in time, you cannot leave the single market and the customs union, and at the same time have no border on the island of Ireland. So you end up with some form of controls in the Irish Sea. Now, all of these were red lines of the UK government. They were not compatible with each other. So yes, I would expect that there's a lot of rhetoric. However, there's a difference between rhetoric and actually doing it. I think we need to be careful to see where things develop. Hopefully both sides are also working behind the scenes to calm things down a bit, because the reality is still the same as it was beforehand, that we have an imperfect situation which we have to manage. There's a lot at stake, not only economic exchange, but there's a much more at stake in terms of the conflict and what might happen. So the only thing we can do is try to work with what we've got in place now. But I also don't see what alternative we have, because we certainly are not going to start trying to devise a new Northern Ireland protocol because the basic dilemmas have not changed.
Exactly. Janis, a thought on this?
It was just an addition with respect to the internal dimension, because yes, this was definitely a mistake which should never have happened. And even if it was done away within a couple of hours, it still is out there. So it should not have happened. And it is showcasing some deficiencies within the Commission, within the system, a lack of coordination between services, a small group of people concentrated among those who the president very much trusts. And this is something which has created a blame game within the institution, where other services are asking that the responsibility should be taken by those who actually have to bear the responsibility. It has resulted in a blame game outside of the Commission, blaming the Commission of being incompetent, of not being up to the task, which is providing material to all those who are looking for someone to blame. And as we know, blaming the EU or the Commission is often very easy at the national level, and it is undermining the ability of the Commission to be the crisis manager it needs to be. So this was a big mistake with respect to the relationship with the UK, between Ireland and Northern Ireland, but it was a grave also mistake from an internal EU institutional and EU 27 perspective.
Okay, we'll come back to maybe the lessons that the President or the Commission might learn from this. But Fabian, just on the question now of where we go from here, we've seen this letter from Michael Gove demanding, it's very strident and it's a long letter and it says, and these aren't all our demands, there will be more, but crucially saying we need a grace period till 2023 now on checks on goods at the border. We also see a lot of people saying, okay, some of these other problems, taking aside Northern Ireland, problems, for example, the fishing industry is having with exporting, problems on both sides with import-export. Oh, it's teething problems. Oh, it'll work itself out. Number one, are they teething problems, or is this really symptomatic of exactly what you described? This is the new reality. It isn't going to change. And to those who say, as some industries are to the EU, oh, can't you be more pragmatic about this? We need to fix this. Well, how should the EU respond? How should it respond to the Michael Gove letter about the Northern Ireland Protocol? And how should it respond to those who say, you're just making this too difficult, help us during these teething problems, and then it'll all go away?
I think certainly there are a number of teething problems. It is clear that business didn't have enough time to prepare properly. I mean, we have cases of guidance coming out within 6 hours of that guidance coming into place. I mean, clearly there is no way to prepare properly for that. And there will be a number of issues where things need to settle down. But I don't think that is the fundamental issue, because even if we take these as teething problems, there are also underlying problems which are much more significant, which have to do with leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. This is what happened. The UK is now out, and many people across the years have warned that this means that there will be barriers. How big these barriers are, yes, there was a debate about, but barriers are inevitable if you're no longer in the same single market. And some of these barriers are also going to be persistent because on the EU side, actors within the single market have a right to expect that rules are being enforced. So they are not going to just simply let go of those rules for the sake of a third country. So I think what we're going to see is actually, I'm afraid, an increase in the problems rather than a decrease, not least because at the moment we have a very low volume of trade. Because of COVID-19, much less is going across the border than in normal times. So once that ramps up, I think we're going to see it gets increasingly more difficult. Also, the contingency arrangements of companies are going to run out. If you have, for example, stocked up in expectation of this to happen, then these stocks will start to run low. So what we are going to see is a significant reconfiguration of supply chains, people going to new producers, customers shifting their loyalties. And these effects are going to be permanent. They're not going to be temporary. And I don't think there's anything which can be done about that. Now, that still means when it comes to Northern Ireland, we should be sitting down and very practically talk about, are there ways we can ease this? Are there ways we can make this better? But it has to be done within the framework of the overall settlement, which both sides agreed. And there's nothing in this settlement which was unknown before it actually came into place.
I was going to say, when you read the letter and some of the demands that are being made, it's impossible to meet those within the framework that has been agreed. And as you say, it was all known. Janis, the EU is, but maybe it was inevitable, losing the narrative war in the UK debate anyway. It's all the EU's fault. They're being too stringent. They're being too strict, leaving aside for a moment what we've all agreed was a very serious blunder in relation to Article 16. But more broadly, should the EU show that it is trying to find solutions to these problems, or should it be being blunt and saying, this is what you signed up for, this is what leaving the single market means, as Fabian said?
I think, as very often in politics, it's also the same case this time. You need to do both. You need to try to find a way to accommodate, but at the same time, you also need to be strict and stick to the position which you've had all the time. So I think that you need to, taking up what you were asking, you need to do both from a European perspective. Having said that, let's not forget that this has been a very strong issue in the UK. It has been a very strong issue in Ireland. But if you look throughout the rest of the EU 27, you will see that this is not something which is predominant now in the public debate. So this is not something which is in the center of attention. And given all the problems also now with respect to the European perspective on the COVID-19 crisis, there are other issues which member states are looking at.
Just one last quick question on this, and then I want to come back to what the events of the last couple of weeks mean for the Ursula von der Leyen's Commission. Fabian, I just wanted to ask about this argument about diplomatic status and whether it matters or not. This is the UK refusing to recognise the EU, to give it diplomatic status, saying, somewhat ironically, well, it's just another international organisation. I say ironically because it was all about, we want our sovereignty back. It was all about, you're a super state and we want no part of it, in arguing for Brexit. And now they say, oh, you're just like the OECD or something like that. No, you can't have it. This has led, on the other side, the EU to delay the new ambassador, the new UK ambassador, having formal meetings with the council and so on. Does it matter? And is there any sign that this will be resolved if it does matter?
I think the first question is, does it matter in itself, or does it matter because it tells us something about the broader relationship? I think you can argue about whether it matters in itself. Certainly, I think it would be very strange if the UK is the only country in the world which chooses not to recognize the EU ambassador. But I think it is something which will be resolved because, frankly, there will just be sufficient pressure from the EU. The question is, why is the UK doing this? Is this grandstanding? Is this trying to play to the domestic audience? Or is there something more behind it? Now, I suspect there's something more behind it. Not for all members of the government. I think there are a number of more sensible members of the government, but for a certain hardcore Brexiteers, this is coming back to the question of why did we want to leave the European Union? And it's a fundamental ideological opposition to the idea of an international organization achieving this kind of status, having that kind of rule, that it is being treated almost like a super state, as you said. And I think this bodes very badly for the relationship, because if you can't even accept each other as equal partners in a relationship, which sit down together, and particularly in areas where the EU does have competences to act for the member states, how can we then come to conclusions, for example, on the issue of climate change, where the EU has to speak with one voice through its External Action Service to influence the COP26 in Glasgow at the end of this year? If you don't even recognize that the person you're talking to has the right status to be talking to them, it's a problem.
So it appears to be ideological rather than something tactical, which often you see, we do this and then we get that. No, this seems to be much more fundamental and ideological. 142 countries say the EU has diplomatic status. One currently says it doesn't. Janis, let us move on before Fabian and I get too depressed. Can I turn just finally to what all of this means for the Commission? As you've pointed out, there have been criticisms of some of the deficiencies, a lack of coordination within the Commission, relying on a very small coterie of advisors who she trusts, but not talking to others. Slightly bizarrely, it seems to me, very publicly getting her spokesman to point the finger of blame at someone else, at Valdis Dombrovskis, for all of this. Where does it leave her? How badly damaged has she been, both within the institution, do you think, and more broadly in national capitals?
I think that she has been damaged, and that this is coming at the wrong moment in time, because in the entire COVID-19 health crisis context, but also beyond that, the Commission is playing a leading role. So you need a strong Commission in the center of action. And if then the Commission is being weakened by mistakes which are being committed, mishandling of certain situation which is happening, this is obviously bad news. Now, how bad it will be depends also on what the crisis management will look like in the upcoming days and upcoming weeks. So this is repairable. However, having said that, we already see, and I said that earlier, that in a good number of member states, including her home country, Germany, this is being used in order to attack her. And let's not forget, in Germany, you're having federal elections at the end of the year, and she is coming from the Conservative Party, and everybody's aware of that. So it's not only hitting against her, it's also politics which play into this. So I think it's not good news. And it is showing that actually within the Commission, there are things which need to change. There are things where, even though she is in place now since 2019, the system in which she's operating, which the president is operating, resembles a lot the system she was also using at the national level. And at the national level, it was creating problems, but at the European level, I think it's creating even more problems, because it's creating a situation within the Commission, which is not only putting her under pressure, but it's putting the entire Commission under pressure and the performance of the Commission. And as you were saying, there were blames which were put on others within the college, but also within the services. And these things might not be forgotten, so they could undermine the ability of the Commission to operate. So it's not good news, but it still is repairable.
Okay. If it's repairable, Fabian, what does she need to do? What's the lesson she needs to learn from this? And how do things need to change?
I think it's still important that we bear in mind that there are two types of lessons. I think there are lessons for this Commission and what this Commission has to do differently in future, but there are also broader lessons about how we deal with crisis at the European level, how we deal with uncertainty, how we deal with the difference between government and governance, where in a crisis we actually need to have a Commission which acts a bit more like a government, which can make decisions, but which is also inclusive in terms of how it draws on input from different parts. I think that there are a number of lessons on both of these fronts. Certainly, it is repairable, as Janis is saying. I think in the end, what we are still facing is an age of crisis. I know that sounds a little depressing, but I don't think we will be out of crisis anytime soon. So there's plenty of time also to prove that the Commission can deal with these kind of situations, is effective. We shouldn't also forget that when it comes to the MFF, when it comes to the recovery plans, we did have a success at the European level. So it's not that everything has gone badly. But in the end, it will be about proving that the instruments, the institutions we have at the European level are able to deal with these kind of situations and are able to deliver what, in the end, people on the ground care about, which is that their issue is resolved, whether that be vaccines or anything else the Commission deals with.
Thank you very much. Janis, we have 1 minute left, so please quickly.
Just one point of addition to what Fabian said, because he's right. There were a lot of successes, which also had to do with how the Commission has operated, especially after May, June of last year. So we shouldn't forget these successes. However, having said that, the president has also, to a big degree, relied on support from Berlin. And she was and could have been sure of support from Angela Merkel, which was very strongly shown in May and June, but also in December, when Germany was having the Council presidency. But now we are in a new situation. Angela Merkel's clock is ticking even louder. There is no German presidency. The election campaign in Germany has started. So that means that support from Berlin will not be as strong as it has been for the president and thus also for the commission. I think that's something which changes the political environment in which the commission will be operating. So it needs to show political wiseness and smartness over the upcoming period.
On that note, gentlemen, that is all we have time for. So thank you very much. As always, thank you again to Simona for joining us for the first half of the debate and for her insights and analysis of where we are with the health union. We will be back in a couple of weeks. Hi again, Simona. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks to you, Jacki. It was a pleasure.
It's been great to have you with us. We will be back in a couple of weeks' time, Janis, Fabian and I. In the meantime, watch out for a publication. The EPC is going to publish the first commentary by its new Associate Director, Ricardo Borges de Castro, on the lessons learned from last week's vaccine wars for EU strategic autonomy. Not an issue we had time to touch on today, but watch out for that. Should be published later on.
Just published.
It has been.
Already on the website.
There you are. As I speak, it is live. So do look out for that one. And next week, just a couple of events to highlight. On Wednesday, decoding the Russia-Turkey relationship. And on Friday, an event on Ukraine, 7 years after Meade. So thank you very much to you all again. It only remains for me to thank you all for joining us and wish you a very pleasant weekend under the circumstances. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.